Hello and welcome to the Daily Aus. I'm Emma Gillespie.
I'm Billi FitzSimons.
This week, some of the world's biggest tech companies are facing a landmark trial in the US. Meta, which owns Instagram and Facebook along with YouTube, are being sued over claims that their platforms are designed to be addictive to children and harm their mental health. The first in a series of trials is taking place in LA, but could reshape how social media works worldwide. Today, we will explain what's happening, how we got here, and what it could mean for young people everywhere, including here in Australia.
Emma, so this is a huge story that could have huge implications for everyone who uses social media. Do you want to just give us a big picture of what is happening? Because like you said, there's a series of lawsuits. It's not just one.
So we are talking about several lawsuits which are due to be heard in the US starting this week. Now, at the center of this initial case is a 20-year-old from California who's being identified only by her initials KGM. So I will refer to her as KGM throughout the episode. According to court documents, KGM started using social media when she was just 10 years old, and she says she became addicted to social media platforms and developed depression, anxiety, and body image issues as a result. Now, the complaint says that the more she used these platforms, the worse her mental health became. Ultimately, her lawyers argue that social media robbed her of her childhood and that this experience is typical of many children in the US. The lawsuit claims that Instagram, TikTok, Snapchat, and YouTube all deliberately designed features to hook young users and to keep them coming back, even though the companies knew, according to the lawsuit, that this could harm young users' mental health.
So just to be clear, this lawsuit involves all of those companies. The allegations are against all of the ones you just listed: Instagram, TikTok, Snapchat, and YouTube.
Well, initially, that's what this trial was shaping up to be, but not quite anymore. So just before the trial started, both TikTok and Snapchat ended up settling outside of court with KGM. So those settlements have not been revealed, details haven't been made public, an undisclosed amount of money was obviously agreed to there, but it now means that this trial is focusing on Meta and YouTube alone. So Snapchat and TikTok have been left out of the proceedings because they came to a deal. What makes this case really significant though, Billi, is that it's being called a bellwether trial, which basically means that it is a test case that could have massive implications. So there are thousands of similar lawsuits around the world waiting in the wings, brought by other teenagers, parents, school districts, and even state governments. And how this first trial goes will likely influence all of those other cases.
And so what are the specific allegations against Meta and YouTube? Like, how are they accused of breaking the law?
So the key claim is that these companies didn't just create platforms where bad content exists, but that they deliberately engineered their apps to be addictive. The lawsuit points to specific features like push notifications, video autoplay when you get served videos that play without you even choosing to watch them, infinite scrolling, where you can just keep scrolling forever and ever and there's no end point, as well as recommendation algorithms. Now, the lawsuit argues that these features work out exactly what keeps users engaged and then feeds them more and more and more of that content to their detriment. The plaintiffs argue that these features create what they call dopamine-driven feedback loops. Basically, this idea that these platforms are hijacking the brain's reward system to keep users, especially young ones, glued to their screens for as long as possible.
And so what you were talking about before with this being a bellwether case, the idea is that we're not sure exactly how this fits into the law. So the outcome of this trial would kind of set the law in a weird way, which courts can do.
Yeah, it would set a precedent for other cases.
Okay, and so how have Meta and YouTube responded?
Well, both companies strongly dispute these claims, which is no surprise given that they opted not to settle before the trial, not to reach an agreement before going to court. Meta said in a statement that the lawsuits misrepresent their company and the work they do to provide young people with safe experiences online. They say they're proud of the progress they've made in recent years on teen safety, which is a similar line to what we've heard from YouTube. YouTube's parent company Google said the allegations are simply not true, and that providing young people with a safer, healthier experience has always been core to their work. Both these platforms, it should be noted, say that there is no direct link between using social media and mental health problems. They say that this is not a link that's been definitively proved. Meta has been particularly vocal about this, saying that blaming teen mental health struggles on social media alone oversimplifies a serious issue. They've pointed to other factors like academic pressure, school safety concerns, socioeconomic challenges. So they're saying this is a much bigger issue. Both Meta and YouTube also point to safety features that they've introduced in recent years. As I've mentioned, that includes things like parental controls, time limits, and restrictions on who can contact teen accounts.
What's interesting about that is you said that this person, the plaintiff, is 20 and they started using these accounts when they were 10.
Yes.
So even if they introduced things in the past couple of years, I imagine that you actually have to look at what was being done 10 years ago.
Yeah, it's a decade worth of social media usage that represents, a country and an entire world, a generation of social media users.
And Emma, you mentioned at the start that this is just an initial case in a series of trials. So what do we know about the other cases?
Hi, I'm Zara. I'm the co-founder of the Daily Aus, and we started this company because we think news can be done differently. If you agree, you can hit subscribe. It's the best way to help us grow. Now, back to the video.
Yeah, there are actually more than 20 other proceedings that are expected to follow this initial one across both LA courts and federal courts in the US. Now, that includes some lawsuits from school districts. So certain school districts have actually come together to bring legal action, arguing that social media platforms are such a public nuisance that the costs of dealing with addicted students are being passed on to the public, that the education system is suffering as a result. Now, the first school district trial is scheduled to start in June in California, but additionally, there are more than 40 US state attorneys general who have filed their own lawsuits against Meta specifically, claiming that it's harming young people and contributing to a youth mental health crisis. So this really is just the beginning of what could potentially be several years of litigation.
Wow. And how do they find a verdict in this case? I mean, if we just take the first one, for example, will it be a judge, a jury? Who's deciding the result?
Yeah, this is a jury-determined trial. So it's expected to last several weeks. The outcome will be determined by a jury. And this is where it gets really interesting. And your question earlier, Billi, about the kind of law and what laws are allegedly being broken here. We're going to learn about thousands of pages of internal company documents during this case that have never been made public before. So that includes internal research by Meta and YouTube on how their platforms affect children, messages between executives discussing design features, and expert testimony from both sides. We're also going to hear from Meta CEO Mark Zuckerberg and Adam Mosseri, who runs Instagram. They are both expected to testify in person, and that's quite unusual. We've already seen some snippets of internal documents that have either been unsealed or leaked in the media. One exchange between Meta employees that I wanted to read out to you compared Instagram to drugs and poker machines. One employee wrote, "Oh my gosh, y'all, IG, Instagram is a drug." Another responded, "Lol, I mean, all social media, we're basically drug pushers."
And if the jury does side against these platforms, so sides with the plaintiff, what are the consequences?
The potential consequences could be huge. KGM, the plaintiff, and her lawyers aren't just seeking financial compensation for damages. This is not clear-cut civil suit. They want changes to how social media apps are actually designed, how they're functioning. So if they win this case, it could set a precedent for other lawsuits, yes, but it could also change the way that apps work, which would impact all of us. Meta has warned that if it's found liable in certain cases, that this could significantly impact its business and financial results. It warned that it is forecasting to potentially take a hit to its finances as a result of certain litigation before the courts this year. And I do just want to point out, though, that Meta reported its full year 2025 results last week. Revenue is up 22% to US $201 billion. That's 289 billion Aussie dollars. But beyond money, there could be forced changes to how platform works, either forced by US state governments, the federal government. And we're talking about things like warning labels before you log on, restrictions on certain features for young users, or maybe even bans on specific design elements that are deemed too addictive. The whole idea of the algorithm could be reshaped. Some experts are actually describing this lawsuit or this movement of lawsuits as having the potential to end up looking like tobacco does today, that these reforms could lead to heavy regulation and require platforms to fund prevention and treatment programs in the same way that we saw tobacco shift and transform in the 90s.
I guess in response to that, I mean, one thing that is different to the tobacco companies is that when we talk about the platforms being held responsible, I guess one thing that they might say is that it is the content that users are posting to their platforms. And so that's where there is a bit of a difference. And, you know, as a media company, we are responsible for what we post to Instagram or to YouTube.
Yeah.
But here it's, well, actually, are the platforms responsible for what the users post? How does that work?
Yeah, this is a really tricky and interesting one. And there are laws in the US that protect platforms from this exact issue. So, for example, if someone posts something defamatory on Facebook, that user can be sued, but Facebook itself can't.
Yes.
But the key thing with this case is the plaintiffs aren't arguing about user-generated content. They're not saying Meta or YouTube should be held liable for a particular video or post that someone made that might be hate speech or promoting violence. They're focusing instead on the design of these platforms themselves. So they're arguing that features like infinite scrolling, like the algorithm, that these are very specific product design choices that are made by the company. And it's not about the third-party content. It's about, I suppose, the engineering of these platforms.
Yeah. No, that makes sense. And so then when should we expect to hear a verdict?
Well, the first trial is expected to last 6 to 8 weeks, so it could be a while. Jury selection is happening right now. There's about 75 potential jurors being questioned. That will have to be narrowed down significantly. And then there'll be the actual trial. So that will have to hear evidence, testimony from KGM, testimony from Mark Zuckerberg and other executives. There'll be expert witnesses, as well as those thousands of pages of internal documents being presented. So realistically, we're probably looking at a verdict sometime in March or April. But given the significance of this case, there will almost certainly be appeals regardless of the outcome from either side. So this is a legal battle that really could stretch on for quite a while. I don't think that it's too extreme to suggest it could stretch for years.
I keep thinking when you're saying that we are only about a month into 2026 and it feels like the unsealing of private documents is the flavour of this year. I feel like this year the news cycle has just been releasing of private documents after private documents, which is probably perhaps a good thing, you know?
We're in the unredacted era.
Yes, we are. Emma, thank you for explaining that.
Thanks, Billi.
And thank you so much for listening to this episode of The Daily Aus. We'll be back this afternoon with your evening headlines, but until then, we hope you have a wonderful day.